episode 23 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Before we start, here are our 3 ground rules. First, our aim is to bring you an accurate presentation of classical Epicurean philosophy as the ancient Epicureans understood it, which may or may not be the same as what you hear about Epicurus at other places today. Second, we aren't talking about Lucretius with the goal of promoting any modern political perspective. Epicurus must be understood on his own, and not in terms of competitive schools which may seem similar to Epicurus but are fundamentally different and incompatible, such as Stoicism, Humanism, Buddhism, Taoism, Atheism, or Marxism. Third, the essential base of Epicurean philosophy is a fundamental view of the nature of the universe. When you read the words of Lucretius, you'll find that Epicurus did not teach the pursuit of virtue or luxury or simple living as ends in themselves, but rather he taught the pursuit of pleasure. From this perspective, it is feeling which is the guide of life, and not supernatural gods, idealism, or virtue ethics. And as important as anything else, Epicurus taught that there's no life after death, and that any happiness we'll ever have must come in this life, which is why it is so important not to waste time in confusion. Now let's join today's discussion with Charles reading the text from Book 2.
But now, come on, remember you attend while I explain by what motion the genial seeds of matter produce the various kinds of bodies, and dissolve them when produced, and by what force compelled they act, and what celerity of motion they possess to force their way through all the mighty void. For certain it is that no seeds of matter stick close and unmoved among themselves, for we see everything grows less, and perceive all things wear away by a long tract of time, and by old age removes them quite from our sight, and yet the mass of things still remains safe and entire. And for this reason, because the particles of matter which fall off lessen the bodies from which they fall, but add to those to which they join. There they force to decay, those, on the contrary, they increase, nor do they remain in this posture. And thus the universe of things is continually renewing. Generations succeed one another, one kind of animal increases, another wastes away. And in a short time the living creation is entirely changed, and like racers, delivers the lamp of life to those that are behind. But if you think the seeds of things can be at rest, and, being themselves unmoved, can give motion to bodies, you wander wildly from the way of true reason. For since all the seeds of things are rambling through the void, they must necessarily be borne along either by their own natural gravity, or by the outward stroke of something else. For then these seeds, tending downward, meet with others. They must all fly off and rebound a different way, and no wonder, since they are hard bodies and of solid weight, nor is there anything behind to stop the motion. But, that you may perceive more plainly how all the seeds of matter are tossed about, you must recollect that there is no such thing in the universe as the lowest place, where the first seeds may remain fixed, because I have shown fully, and proved by certain reason, that space is without end, without bounds immense, and lies extended every way. This being plain, there can be no rest possibly allowed to these first seeds, forever wandering through the empty void, but being tossed about with constant and different motion, and striking against other bodies. Some rebound to a great distance, others fly off, but not so far, such of them as rebound but for a small distance, their contexture being more close, and being hindered by their natural twinings. These compose a solid root of rocks and the hard bodies of iron, and a few other things of the same nature, but such as wander widely through the void, and moved by the blow, fly further off and rebound to greater distances. These compose the thin air and the sun's bright light.
Okay, thank you, Charles. So he's introducing the topic. He switched away from talking about the issue of it being sweet to observe the ills from which we are immune, and now going back to discussing the atoms again.
Is this the first time he's mentioned the atoms moving downward?
I'm thinking not, but I can't remember exactly from book one.
I certainly he did this before, because this is one of the refuted parts of the of Epicurean physics. So and we had this before, I think, already.
And so maybe it's really in the second passage here where he is explaining why he is concerned about this, that he wants to explain how some things increase, others decrease, and how the explanation arises from the movement of the atoms from one place to the other, how things are continually renewed. I think we made a comment earlier in our discussion about one of the sections we may talk about today, the dust analogy. I think this analogy that's in this paragraph about how things are like racers who deliver the lamp from one racer to another. I guess that's maybe the Olympic model, perhaps, of carrying the torch.
Mm-hmm.
That's another analogy that I think is very familiar to many people.
Oh, now it makes sense. I didn't even understand this part of that paragraph.
Yeah, I think that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense, surely.
Yeah, I was thinking like a baton race.
I think baton somewhere along in one of these sections is used as another example as well. Yeah, I think this happens a lot. We read a passage and we really don't even have a clue what he's talking about at first. So I know people who would listen in. I know that's what I do. I have no clue what he's talking about until I go through it and try to put it in some kind of a context. And so in order to explain how the race or baton analogy works, he then has another paragraph about how things are constantly in motion. Now, I guess the main part of the next paragraph would be that there is no resting place for the atoms to come to rest. And so since there is no resting place, now he's thinking in terms of them all falling downward, but because there's no resting place to support them, they're constantly moving.
Yeah, here I'm stuck again. What does this mean? What does the first mean?
Which part, Martin?
This being plain, there can be no rest possibly allowed to these first seeds. So what does that first mean?
That did cross my mind.
Where are you guys reading again? Well, that's the next paragraph from what I was looking at. But
it says the same at first. No?
Yeah, this being plain, there can be no rest possibly allowed to these first seeds.
This being plain that there's no place for them to come to rest at the bottom of the universe or any other supporting location. There's nothing outside the universe to support them. That means they're forever just falling in his analogy through the void or moving through the void. And so what part of that, Martin, do you think is...
Here. It occurs in the earlier paragraph as well, close to the end, where the first seeds may remain fixed. No, I see it there as well.
Yes.
So what does this first mean?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, Martin, that I don't understand your question. He's saying that there's no boundary to the universe against, or no, there's like no floor, no ceiling, no walls against which a atom could come to rest, right?
Yeah, but in an infinite universe, there are no first seeds. If we take these as a first, so these are, so to say, the first which are there, it doesn't make sense.
Okay, now you're putting first in terms of time. I did not read it that way. When I read him talking about first seeds, I don't consider those to be anything other than the atoms themselves, because we know that all of the atoms are eternal. But I think it would be sort of normal language to say first seed, meaning, again, bodies being composed of combinations of seeds, the first seeds being the atoms themselves.
Okay. So these are the smallest particles we have, the elementary particles.
I think
that's just the meaning.
Yeah, that's my impression, because Bailey's translation says first bodies.
That's one of the complications of all this, is that we're constantly switching back and forth our context between atoms being the very smallest ones, but we also know that they come together to form the bodies that form the things that we see and interact with. And so, we talked about that, I think, in connection with seeds last week, or one of the recent podcasts, is we tend to think of seeds as, I know Elaine was saying this, making this point, we think of seeds as being oak tree seeds or vegetable seeds. And of course, we know that those are composed of all sorts of many types of atoms, and nevertheless, they are seeds. But on the other hand, Lucretius and Epicurus talk about the atoms
being those things which are ultimately the seeds of everything else. So
not even just them. Seeds was kind of the common language to describe this.
Right. And can give motion to bodies. I'm reading that paragraph that you're reading, but if you think that the seeds of things can be at rest and being themselves unmoved can give motion to bodies. So even in that sentence there, he's talking about obviously both atoms and combinations of atoms when he's talking about bodies there. I think, unless he could be talking about just one atom giving motion to another atom, but it's clear from the philosophy that they do come together and form the things that we interact with. So he could be talking about either one. This reminds me of a passage from this David Sedley article we were talking about recently, the one where he's entitled Epicurus' Refutation of Determinism. And I think, Martin, you made a comment about that. Did you read that, Martin? Because I saw you commented about it.
Yeah, the one. I mean, the Sedley article, like I said, I didn't read, or I may have read it in the past if it was linked before, but I don't remember it.
I see. I need to read the one that you posted about. I read the one. I'm a big fan of David Sedley's work in general. Nobody's going to agree with everybody all the time, but David Sedley, in my view, seems to be very sympathetic with Epicurus and take a very productive tack towards interpreting what he says. And it's Sedley's position in that article on determinism that he thinks that the swerve theory was an afterthought by Epicurus, which explains why it's not included in the letter to Herodotus. And he thinks that this would certainly be controversial. I'm not sure I completely agree with it, but I have respect for his opinion, so it's worth talking about. He thinks that Epicurus developed the idea of the swerve later on, basically to allow, this is the point you made, I saw, Martin, it allows free will to take place because it sort of breaks you out of the billiard ball mechanistic model. But he doesn't think that Epicurus really started at that position with thinking that the swerve existed. And the reason I go into all that, I'm sorry, I'm getting off my train of thought. The reason I go into all of that, it's Sedley's position that all you have to do is think about these atoms bouncing against each other like he's talking about in this paragraph. All you really needed is one bounce at some point, and then everything, you'd have unlimited, presumably, other bounces going on as they go off in different directions and interfere with each other's path. So to wrap up what I was trying to say, Sedley kind of thinks that the atoms bounding against themselves and rebounding as described in this passage was really all that Epicurus ever needed to come up with in terms of how worlds were formed. And in that respect, he really only needed one bounce somewhere in order to get all these other bounces into a chain reaction, so that it's not really necessary for Epicurus to have concluded that every atom all the time can be swerving. All that was really needed was one bounce.
No, that is wrong.
Okay, tell me why. That would be very interesting, Martin.
Yeah, because this, if just one bounce is enough, it's not enough, because this would happen. If it's just one, it would happen at least locally at a defined time and at a locally defined place. And then it would spread out with a limited speed. This would give a defined origin for the universe. No, it would be that one would be something like a defined origin of the universe. It would be something which would resemble our Big Bang, no? And this is not what we see.
That's a very interesting point. And are you saying, Martin, also would it be implicit if it was just one? Would the bouncing as it spread out become more subdued and more subdued and more subdued and eventually peter out entirely?
Yeah, so this is possible. It depends on the density of the particles, how much it spreads, how dense they are. So if that happens in a part of the universe where things are not dense, then it may really peter out, and or at least for a very long time. So just one is not enough, and also to be observable, it has to happen quite often, and that's what we actually see. It happens all the time.
Again, further risk of going off in a tangent. I've thought about that several times in the past myself in terms of, do we think that every atom is constantly swerving, or is there some limited number of them swerving? Are there types of atoms which would not have the capacity to swerve versus types of atoms which do? Is there anything that gives us a hint about that?
Yes. When the thing is, it's not really that some atoms don't swerve at all and the others all the time. There's no particles doing it all the time. It just does it sometimes, because it's occasionally. So they do this sometimes. So if we observe a particle long enough, it does it. or we can, for simplicity, we can look at slightly more composed parts like the radioactive nuclei. No? So if we take one with a short lifetime, then many of them will do this very quickly. But if you look at uranium, one of these common uranium isotopes, they take on average billions of years to do one's work.
Mm-hmm. One reason to you just said something at the end there that I have no capacity to absorb or agree with or disagree with. Did you just say something about a uranium atom swerving?
Yes. The nucleus, no, the uranium nucleus. No.
That some part of it swerves only at a very low rate? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean the decay. It's a radioactive decay.
So
one.
Oh yes, okay. So you're talking about the things with longer half-lives. Okay.
And then electrons on an excited state, they have a similar behavior, but they do this typically much faster. No? So their half-life is determined by picoseconds or something like that. Typically,
they decay much faster than
from the excited state. No, the electron doesn't decay, just that they jump from the excited state to a lower state, and that it is a range from picoseconds to several minutes, depending on what are the properties of the two states they connect.
We're not at it yet, but as we go into book 2 further on, I think when he starts talking about the atoms that compose the spirit or the mind, there's a comment about that those atoms within the body are among the lightest or fastest or most, I want to say lightest. I'm not sure what the right word is. I don't know if Charles or Martin, if you remember where I'm going there,
Swiftest.
Swiftest maybe, and then there's an unnamed element. This may be what we're talking about, atoms of spirit as well. And I know that.
Yeah, and this is a refuted part of Epicurean physics. So our models are away from that. So this one we can consider as nonsense.
We should probably read the rest of the section we were at besides.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should I go ahead with that? Or?
Yes, go ahead.
Besides, there are many seeds keep wandering through the void that are refused all union with other seeds, nor could ever be admitted to join their motion to anything else. An instance or representation of this, as I conceive, is always at hand, and visibly before our eyes. When the sun's light shoots its rays through a narrow chink into a darkened room, you shall see 1,000 little atoms dance 1,000 ways through the empty space, and mingle in the very rays of light, engaging, as it were, in endless war, drawing up their little troops, never taking breath, but meeting and exercising their hostile fury with constant blows. And hence you may collect in what manner the principles of things are tossed in this empty void. So small an instance will give you an example of these extraordinary motions and open a way to your knowledge of greater events. But there it is fit you should apply yourself more closely to observe these bodies which seem so disturbed in the sun's beams. For it appears that these disorders, there are certain secret principles of motion in the seeds themselves. Though it's invisible to us, for some of these modes you will see struck by secret blows and forced to change their course, sometimes driven back and again returning, nor this nor that, and every other way. And this variety of motion is certainly in the very seeds, for the first principles of things first move of themselves. Then compound bodies that are of the least size and approach nearest, as it were, to the exility of the first seeds are by them struck with blows unseen, and put into motion, and these again strike those that are something larger. So from first seeds all motion still goes on, till at length it becomes sensible to us. And thus we see how these modes that play in the sun's beams are moved, though the blows by which they are driven about do not so plainly appear to us. And now, my Memmius, you may in brief from the following instance collect how rapid is the motion of the first seeds. For when the morning spreads the earth with rising light, and sweet variety of birds frequent the woods, and fill each grove with most delighted notes through the soft air, every one perceives, and the thing we see is plain, how suddenly and in a moment the rising sun covers the world and shines with instant light. But what vapor, that glittering ray, which the sun sends forth, does not pass through mere empty space, and therefore is forced to move slower, as it has resisting air to part and divide as it goes. Nor are the principles that compose this ray simple first seeds, but certain little globular bodies made up of these first seeds that pass through the air. And these first seeds being agitated by various motions, these little bodies which are formed of them are retarded by different motions within themselves, and are likewise hindered from without by other bodies. and so are obliged to move the slower. But seeds that are solid and simple in their nature, when they pass through a pure void, having nothing to stop them from without, and being one and uncompounded through all their parts, are carried at once, by an instant force, to the point to which they first set out. Such seeds much exceed the rays of the sun in their motion, and be carried on with much more celerity. They must pierce through longer tracts of space in the same time in which the sunbeams pass through the air. For these seeds cannot agree together by design to move slowly, nor stop in the air to search into particulars, and be satisfied with for what reason their several motions are thus carried on and disposed.
Thanks, Martin. You're probably the best one to or comment.
Yeah, okay. Now that when I read it, I focus on grammar and things like this, so I don't understand what I read. So now let me read it again that I understand it. I see a lot of analogies to modern physics in there. Not only this one, there are a lot of analogies in there.
Well, go ahead then.
Okay, but let me finish reading it. That was fine.
Okay.
It's definitely reminiscent of Brownian motion again.
Mm-hmm.
And Brownian motion means what?
I'll let Martin explain.
That is what we can see in microscopically visible particles, or in what he shows here with the dust. If you see a dust in the sun rays, they do also the Brownian motion. I mean, partly it's overwhelmed by airstream, but if there is not much airstream, you can see the original Brownian motion, but it's more easy to see and quantify under a microscope if you look at the small things like bear lab, not seeds, there's spores, bear lab spores in the water, suspended in water. You can see their motion, quantify it, and then describe this. So, and that motion comes from the water molecules impinging on them statistically, and this leads then to some erratic path of or some erratic movement, some jitter of these spores.
Is this the bouncing aspect of things?
More along the lines of motion in a space.
Yes. So this just bouncing, that is just between the elementary particles. So they're in the way of each other, and then they're bouncing forth and back, and then depending, because they may have complex shapes. So an assembly of parts with complex shapes, even if they're approached like Epicurus does as hard bodies, they still can stay together for quite some time, but they keep bouncing inside that assembly. But what he mentions here now, that is more this hierarchy of what happens. No? So he really sees it completely through. So what he now calls the first bodies as the elementary particles. So they may hit the larger ones and cause some jitter on them. The movement of these larger ones then causes jitter of an even larger hierarchy of parts, and until it reaches the spore size of bodies, which we can observe under a microscope, and there we can then actually observe it experimentally. Interestingly, then the next hierarchy point, it's no more visible easily. So what you might do is, for a next one, you use a laser and use an interference method to create an experiment that you can detect the motion of an even larger body where the spores impinge on. No? But then it will be. I have never seen that type of experiment. But then we're already at the limit. So we cannot detect our own Brownian motion. We are too big for that. Even though theoretically at a very small scale it happens, but it's just not visible. Also, because we are so extended and are soft at the outside, our outside is not as well defined that we could easily measure that.
Martin, I always have a tendency when I'm reading this material to try to apply it to someone who is relatively uneducated in physics like myself, and I tend to think of it as being, well, he wants to simply reinforce in people that things that we observe and we ourselves are composed of atoms, and that this is the way that atoms work, so that even though someone like myself who's not a physicist doesn't necessarily have to grasp the details of why or what's going on exactly, some level of detail is helpful just to give us confidence that we have a reasonable theory for how things are working. And so I can see much of this here being an explanation that just gives us confidence that the atomic theory is workable and consistent. But there's so much detail here and so much precision. Do you think he's going in other directions? What do you think about where he's going and why he's going there? I mean, he's pretty clear in the philosophy that we're not interested in wisdom for the sake of wisdom. We're always looking for the implications, the practical implications of what we're doing and what we're talking about. Do you see practical implications of these points that might not be obvious to somebody who's not trained in physics?
Yeah, I mean, what she gives in these paragraphs is examples of which we can observe, which are all somehow explainable by this particle movement. No? So, for example, another interesting thing is he basically anticipates the law of refraction, no? Without stating it explicitly, but he really states that the light of the sun is slowed down. No? So the rays of the particles or of the light rays, they're slowed down when they move through a medium. And this is correct.
Charles, what are you thinking about the implications of this? The same point I was making a minute ago, that I don't think he was writing a science textbook for the sake of writing a science textbook.
No, this book was introductory to Roman audiences. I mean, I'm agreeing wholeheartedly with what Martin's saying. But I would like to capitalize on the dust comparison as a good example of how this is easily or made easily relatable to somebody who's not a trained physicist. Because that's something that, well, just about everyone has seen and is able to see.
What we're talking about there, I don't know how you put that into words. I know in my own instance, especially when for some reason I feel like it was when I was younger as a child, I would be lying somewhere looking in a direction where you'd see a beam of light coming through a window, and the beam of light would just highlight these pieces of dust that you would not otherwise have seen. You can't see except in the beam of light, and you see them moving around, dancing basically within the beam of light. I mean, I guess that's what we're talking about here, right? Or is there another way in which we see the dust?
No, but that's very similar again. I mean, you can make it, if it's dark and you stir it up, you breathe it in, and then you sense it, because you know what from past experience, if you breathe in dust, you start coughing, right? Currently, suddenly, no? And so even if we don't see anything and we clean, we dust off things, then we breathe in this one, and then we experience this dust. No?
Yeah, I see the passage that struck my memory is the one that says, when the sun's light shoots its rays through a narrow chink into a darkened room, you shall see 1,000 little atoms dance 1,000 ways through the empty space. I know I've observed that kind of thing myself, and I guess most people have at different times in their lives. It's not something you see every day, but it's certainly something that you see.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be completely dark. I remember in the living room of my parents, when the sun came in through the window, you could easily see this from the side. So it doesn't really have to be that dark. It just under what angle you see that dust, because this dust will shine. When in some of these areas, when from where the light beam, the light rays are reflected then specularly, so that they go into our eyes, and we see these shiny. So we see then these shiny pieces move around in that sunlight. So it doesn't need to be as dark as in these experiments of Newton.
Another passage that catches my eye. So from first seeds, all motion still goes on till at length it becomes sensible to us. And thus we see how these motes that play in the sun's beams are moved. I mean, the part that strikes me as important, till at length it becomes sensible to us. I mean, it's not like this is another dimension of magic or something. This is going on all the time in our own reality. It's just that it becomes sensible to us only when it reaches a certain phase of size, I guess is the right word, or ability to be seen. I guess it would be possible that some people would think that atoms are magical, or that there's something spiritual or some kind of, like I say, a different dimension involved in these things when it's really not. This is a section that in my mind, I don't know whether I'm right or not, but I connect it to observations made in the DeWitt book about how he thinks that really what we're talking about here, we don't really use this description very often, but these are the 12 fundamental principles of physics that supposedly there was a list of, that really, in much the same way that there was the 40 doctrines, there was a separate book or scroll or whatever you want to call it, called the 12 fundamentals
of nature. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. Yeah, and the people who attempt to reconstruct these 12 fundamentals, they all go through these sections of Lucretius and Herodotus and pick out these major items, kind of like what we're doing in reading through Lucretius. We look at several of these passages and summarize them into something like the atoms are always in motion, and probably according to DeWitt or different people who have reconstructed the list of 12, that's pretty much what that list of 12 was, the atoms being always in motion. And then DeWitt makes the point that many of these 12 fundamentals are destructive of the principles of Plato or the principles of idealism, that there is another dimension where there is a firm reality that never changes, where God is, where your ideal horse is, that while all the horses here on earth are just projections of the ideal. So all of these 12 fundamentals, including the atoms always being in motion, are destructive of the idea that anywhere in the universe there is a ultimate eternal reality of ideal forms, because if the atoms are always moving everywhere all the time, the universe cannot be made up of something that is unchanging, other than these things themselves that are constantly rearranging themselves.
And they don't take on the properties of horses or of abstractions like an ideal sense of justice or morality. No,
yes,
they don't.
Yes. And when you use the word abstraction, that we'll probably defer that discussion until later, but that's something that I think is wrapped up into this issue of what is an abstraction, maybe being another word for an ideal form or concept. Do concepts? Yes. Do concepts exist? Do they? If you want to use the word existing for concepts, do they exist outside the human mind? Is a concept real? Is an abstraction real? What is your definition of real and how it fits into all that? Clearly, in my mind, one of the directions I go with that is that I think abstractions are extremely useful and they generate pleasure and pain when we contemplate them or when we deal with them. But that doesn't mean that they are themselves composed of atoms, or it certainly doesn't mean that there is a concept, for example, of, maybe I'd even say, a concept of happiness. The concept of happiness does not exist in the form of a set of atoms arranged in a particular way out in the universe or where God lives. There is no ideal happiness that exists somewhere, or any other. Happiness may be too loaded a term, but any concept that you wanted to talk about is not a set of atoms that exist in an unchanging form somewhere in the universe.
Otherwise, we would hear notions of atoms of pleasure within these sections of Lucretius by now.
That's a great point, Martin. Charles, that is a great point. A great point. There is no atom. Oh, that really almost sets me off in that same direction, because last week, one of the things we were talking about was the issue of, for example, gold. You remember very clearly with me, probably. Elaine was making the point. Gold is pretty. Does that mean that gold is an atom of pleasure? And I think the answer is no, but there are certainly generalizations you can make that certain combinations of atoms are generally going to lead to in human existence in a particular direction, but it's probably the exception that proves the rule. Even gold itself is not always going to generate pleasure in your particular context. And so if it doesn't always do something, then I don't think you can say that an atom of gold is a pleasure atom any more than any other kind of atom can be a pleasure or a pain. Okay, I'm really gone out there. Martin, what do you think? Going back to the more practical question of the implications of the atoms constantly being moving and bouncing off of each other. Can you relate that to Plato?
Yeah, not that one doesn't really work well with Plato. So unless we really go into a mathematical description, as in theoretical physics. So those mathematicians sometimes are Platonists, and they see then their mathematical concepts as examples of Platonic ideals.
Martin, let me follow up with you there. What about Charles's comment a moment ago about atoms of pleasure? Does an atom of pleasure exist?
No.
I don't think so either.
we are together on that I don't think I think the answer is no, but I'm not sure that it's an obvious point, and it probably, whether we'll certainly won't resolve anything today or even maybe go on at length about it, but I think there's tremendous implications of the point that there is no such thing as a pleasure atom or a pain atom.
Because if there was, then we would instantly recognize it through nature.
That's right. I think you're right. And so pleasure, therefore, cannot be a particular type of atom or a particular, perhaps even a particular arrangement of atoms.
Well, even then, let's see, if we go back to previous sections of Lucretius, if atoms were to exhibit some form of pleasure, remember Anaxagoras' homeomery, then a little bit of everything would have or would exhibit some form of pleasure, that's a little far-fetched, and it doesn't really fit anywhere else, and it kind of throws this whole thing out of balance.
You know, have we already gone over the point about how atoms don't even have color to them? There's a section of Lucretius, and we may not have hit that yet, or maybe it was already in part one.
I think we did. I think it was towards the end of book one.
So there's no such thing as a blue atom or an atom of blueness. An atom doesn't have an essence that gives it blueness or an essence that makes it pleasurable or unpleasurable. And yet that is kind of essential to the theories of anybody, Aristotle, Plato, or anybody who wants to say that there's an eternal ideal form of pleasure or that there's any one standard of what blue means. If there is such a thing, if there is an ideal definition of the word blue, it must exist somewhere in the universe that we are trying to find that reference point and identify it. And I think the Epicurean answer would be there is no such thing as an ideal blue or a atom of blue, and that blueness is something that is, what's the right way to say that? A creation of the human mind, or
there's a word for that.
Once again, Mark,
we could go product.
Yeah, a product of the human mind, right? Or something that the human mind generates within itself, which is extremely useful, and I'm not saying anything derogatory about it, but it's not something that exists that has an independent existence outside of the human mind. Blueness doesn't. The way that the atoms are moving, the way that the light is functioning, the way that everything is coming together, yes, all of that exists whether we acknowledge it or not. But to call it blue or to call it pleasure or pain, is that something that is not just subjective within human minds or animal minds?
I think pain is a bit more inflexible in comparison to pleasure. I'm willing to give pain a bit more leeway in that regard.
I think that's funny, probably. But you see, I think that without allowing ourselves to go too far in any tangent direction, I do think it's an important central point about whether an atom of blueness or an atom of pleasure or an atom of pain exists. That every time we identify such an atom, no matter what context we're in, no matter who identifies it, no matter where it's identified, it's going to have some kind of an essence of pleasure or an essence of pain within it.
Yeah, with blueness, that one we can construct something. So, of course, the origin is just that we agree on calling a certain color range in the spectrum we perceive as blue, but we can make a more precise definition, and there's a standard international color chart, and which can be traced back to a particular wavelength. So we can then define this particular wavelength in the center of the blue range as the ideal blue. And then we can have a composed atom, so what we call nowadays atom, not an Epicurean or Lucretian atom, so which then has a transition which makes this modern atom, as a non-elementary particle kind of thing, as something like an ideal blue atom. No?
But like you said, it all starts at the beginning point of humans having sort of a consensus or
exactly.
making a proposal to do something. And if go ahead.
I mean, it has a motivation in the color perception of our eye. So from there, it just makes sense to divide it in some way like this, and then to make a convention like this. So maybe we could choose any other word and just define this as blue, but it somehow makes sense. And other species which develop the ability to do some rudimentary science might come up with something similar.
But again, that would be something that we are organizing in our minds. That doesn't say that. And of course, if you're talking about blue and a particular object appearing to us to be blue within a certain lighting and setting and so forth, I mean, all of those things exist independent of us, the setting, the light, the object we're talking about. And if we all of a sudden shoot ourselves in the head and cease to exist, those things that we're talking about are still going to exist, so that they have an independent existence of their own. But blue's a name or a category or a description that we apply to those things that exist outside of us. But the universe itself has not given it that name, given it that color, given it that description. It's human organization, human conceptualization that has produced. It's a very deep subject, I think, to discuss that.
And the Platonic interpretation is that we characterize these things through an essence that is, well,
I think essence is a word I associate with Aristotle, but yes, Plato's saying that there's an ideal blue that exists in some other dimension where presumably the god or the first mover is living, and in that dimension there is an absolute blue to which all other things that we see as blue are just kind of reflections, and that's the cave analogy. They are dim shadows on the wall of the thing that out there in eternity somewhere is really the blue.
I guess to that comparison, blue is interchangeable with light, from the fire behind the prisoners to the sun outside above the cave.
Or is blue going to be the thing that generates? I mean, the light is what allows them in the cave to see it, I guess, but what is it that casts the shadows? Because, of course, the thing they're seeing on the wall in the cave analogy is shadows moving. So something must exist that casts the shadow on the wall. And I guess maybe
really convincing hand puppets.
That's right. Well, it's been less exciting than it normally would be not to have Elaine with us today. Maybe we should begin to think about it if we have any concluding comments on this section today, and hopefully we'll have Elaine back next week and we'll get her to talk with us about some of this as well. Why don't we talk about if there's any other concluding comments on today's sections?
I can't think of any, no.
Martin?
In this section which we read today, so Lucretius gives a number of examples which in principle can all be traced back to the motion of elementary particles.
And like I said during the podcast, beyond the capacity of many people to have as much physics information as we'd like to have, but this level of detail does provide a connection that we can understand how, even though atoms cannot be seen or touched or visible, how they do ultimately combine and generate the things that we can touch and see. Okay, with that, anybody else?
Not me.
Okay. Well, thanks for today, and we'll come back and do it again next week.
Thanks and bye.
Yep,
Okay.
thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.